Welcome back, guys. Amar here from Magic Coding, and in this video we're looking at our arrays. So what are arrays? So let's say, for example, you want to create an integer I which will be equal to 10. Then you want to create an integer I1 to be equal to 15, integer A2 to be equal to 20. Oh Lord, your job would be so annoying and it will not be good to do. What I mean by it is basically you will have to go and create 10 integers of consistent of A0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you have 10 integers. And because of that, we have arrays. So what is an array? Array is basically an integer or any variable that you want that's put in some sort of list. So what do I mean by it? So if I go ahead and type in integer, I add these two brackets, this will create an array, and I'm gonna create let's say A or data, or I don't know, numbers equals to new int. So new int, and here I type in 10 and add the semicolon. Let me explain. Here we are creating our integer numbers to be equal to this new, which I'm going to talk about later on. So we're creating just a new 10 integers. And now by default, when you create an integer, so if you create an integer I, or integer I, for example, this is by default 0. If you create a boolean, so if you create a boolean G, this is by default false. So by default, all of these numbers are 0. So we're gonna change that later on. But the first thing I want to explain is if you want to get the first number of the integer, you will have to say int brackets, and then let's say, for example, this number will be 5. Now to get the first number, you will have to type in here 0, because arrays are 0 based, not integer but numbers. Numbers at index 0 equals to 5, and the last numbers is at 9. So same as we did for our, let's say, 45 or 50, same as we did for loop. If you start by 0, if it's less than 10, it's gonna end by 9. Now here we have 10, and if I go ahead and print, there is something that's called numbers.length, and I print this will just get us the length of the number. It's gonna return 10. So if I click play, it's gonna return 10, because that is how many arrays we got. But if I try to print numbers, which will be equal at 10, we're gonna get an error, because as I said before, we don't have the 10th one, so index was outside the bounds of the array. I've explained that and at the end of the video, what you can do about it and what does that error means. But you can see we cannot reach that number because the last number is at numbers length, so numbers length minus 1. So this will get us the right number, which will be at 9. And if you start print numbers, we're going to start from 0. Now how we can change these numbers is really simple. As I said before, you just type in the numbers or the name of the array, type in here 0 equals to 5, numbers, then 1 equals to 10. But this is kind of the same as we did at the beginning. So what we can do about it is we can use something that we learned in our previous lesson, which is for loop. If our loop int I equals to 0, and if I is less than numbers.length, now we can use that. Of course, 10 will work as well, but numbers.length is better and it's more practical coding, because if I change here to 5, 15, 100, then it's automatically changed over here. I don't need to change to numbers. So let's say 10, and I can say numbers at index I equals to 0. What will this do? This will make every single number 0, every single number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. But what can we do is we can increase them by 5, or we can add a random value. So let's add a random value. To add a random value, we're going to say random.range, and we're going to give them from 0 to 100. So if you see what happens here, return a random integer number between minimum and maximum. And now let's print, and we're gonna print our number index is, and here plus I, and then plus, here we're gonna say, and the value is, so value is plus numbers at I. So what I did here, well, over here we represent the index or the current number that we are at. So it can be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 as you saw before. And here it's going to represent the value that our number currently has. So if I go ahead here, click play, we're going to say that our number index 0 has the value 14, 32, that will be 1, second will have 58, and so on and so forth. And by chance, our index 9 has the value of 9. Really cool. Now this is how we can change the values for the arrays. Now the more practical way to do it is to have some sort of grid. So let's say, for example, this will be our grid X, and we're gonna change this to grid X with smaller g. And what are we gonna do here is really simple. So let me just copy and change this to here, and let me change this to here. What can we do is we can create an integer that will be temporary number, which will be equal to 0, and every time this runs, or actually I'm gonna make it outside of it, so let's create integer. There are multiple ways, but this, I think it's the most self-explanatory, is to create an integer x, which will be equal to 5, for example, and every time we run into the script, we're gonna say x, or actually when we end, we're gonna say x plus equals to 5, for example, and we're gonna assign our grid I to be at x. So right now, if I go back, we should see that we can get here, if I play, the index 0 is 5, 1 is 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, and 50. So when is this helpful? So let's say, for example, we want to create some grids or some sort of grid that we're gonna create multiple game objects, and we have, so this over here is a grid. And let's say from here to this point is 5, and then we created that right now here, and I can access it anywhere I want. So let's say, for example, later on in the update, I want to spawn an enemy at the grid, which is grid X. Come on, grid, I cannot reach to here. Grid X at maybe 5, that will be somewhere in the middle, and I'm gonna reach it like this. So spawn transform dot position of that game object will be at grid dot X. It's really simple, and you're gonna see later on how we can do it. Also, what can we do with array is to have another for loop. So let me comment this out, and then that for loop will be called for each loop. What will this do is this will get an integer that will be called, for example, num in the numbers, so not in the grid X, my bad, in the grid X, let's say X over here, not number, but X. And here I can say that our X, actually let's say print value of grid X is, and then we can type in plus our X. So let me add the semicolon, and let's see what will happen. Let me go back to Unity, let's clear the console and click play. And you're going to see the value of grid A is 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. What happened? If I go back to here, we have for each loop. What will this do? This will go through every integer inside of the grid X. So we don't need to do that on our own. We don't need the grid X length. It's automatically gonna get its own length, and it's gonna get the value of every single X that we have. What also we can do, we cannot say X equals to 5. That is not possible. You can see here we're gonna have an error. Let me show you. Come on, I did not save the script. Cannot assign X because it is a for each iteration variable. So what are we doing here is we are iterating every integer in the grid X. We cannot assign a value, but we can get something out of it. So for example, when we are for eaching, or when we are iterating our runners in our game, that will happen later on. is that we're gonna go for each. So we're gonna go into every single of runner that we have, which will be 3 runners, and then we're gonna check for their each rank, and based on their rank, we are gonna see who is the best, who is worst, and who is the worst. And that is how we're gonna use for each loop later on. So this is used most of the times, and like only times in when you're using the arrays to get something, to use something, and so on and so forth. So that will be pretty much it about arrays, as I said. But also what I want to mention is that problem that we're gonna have. Let's say, for example, we want to reach the grid x of 11. So print grid x of 10, for example, because we have 10. As you saw before, we're gonna get an error. Right now, no errors. We can run the script, everything's fine. But when we click play, we're gonna see index was outside of bounds of the array. So this means that you're trying to access something that is not there. So the same will happen when you want to check, when you want to get an object that does not exist. You're trying to get an integer that does not exist. Now you're going to see this a lot throughout your game development career, especially when you're starting off. I see it all the time when I make mistakes. Now, of course, now it's less, but when I was starting out, I will usually see index out of range exception. This index out of range exception means that you're trying to achieve something that does not exist. So just double click on it, see what happens here, and here we can see exactly that we're trying to access the 10th, and we only have 10 integer, but we're trying to access 11th one. If I add here one more, boom, this is fixed. And if I click play, we have no error. It's just gonna give us a 0 because, as I said, a default value is 0. So yeah guys, that will be it for arrays. Hope you like it, and I will see you in the next video.